Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Eric Blair, a senior planner with the Air Quality and Climate Change Division at Metro Vancouver. In this presentation, I'm going to give you a brief overview of an initiative that Metro Vancouver is currently engaging on to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from large buildings in the region. Buildings account for 25% of the region's total greenhouse gas emissions, and we've seen these emissions increase by 10% in the last decade. In our region, greenhouse gases from buildings are primarily produced by heating and hot water systems that are powered by natural gas, which is a fossil fuel. Burning natural gas, heating oil, or wood can also produce health-harming air contaminants like nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. This means that shifting buildings to zero emissions technology will not only reduce our impact on the climate, but also provide better air quality and better occupant safety during periods of extreme heat. In response to this, Metro Vancouver has adopted the Clean Air Plan and the Climate 2050 Buildings Roadmap. Developed with the public and many other stakeholders, these plans lay out the strategies and actions that we must take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the buildings sector and achieve the overarching air quality and GHG reduction targets for the region. The plan sets some important targets. By 2030, buildings will achieve a 35% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions relative to what our emissions were in 2010. A 15% reduction in nitrogen oxide emissions relative to 2020 levels. And by 2050, all buildings will be zero emissions in their operations, deriving all energy needs from 100% clean and renewable sources. Metro Vancouver examined emissions from typical sources across the region: buildings and also transportation, industry, off-road engines, waste collection, and others, to determine how much GHG emission reductions would be needed to achieve our region's climate goals. This graphic shows emissions from buildings specifically. The top line is an estimate of emissions from buildings if we made no policy changes in the coming years. You can see the emissions stay fairly consistent above 4 million tons. The colored wedges indicate drops in emissions expected from different policies. The drop for existing buildings is the largest blue area at the top. This significant reduction is driven by changing the way that space and water are heated in buildings across the region. GHG emissions happen at all stages of a building's life, during the design and construction stage, during the operation or renovation stages, and even when the building is demolished at the end of its life. Requirements from local and provincial governments are planned or in place that are making newly constructed buildings more energy efficient, and actions have been identified to reduce the emissions that happen during a building demolition. However, there are currently no requirements that limit the amount of GHG emissions that any building emits while it is in use. This is why the Clean Air Plan and the Climate 2050 Buildings Roadmap include a key action for Metro Vancouver to develop greenhouse gas limits for large buildings. The proposed approach in this presentation takes the first steps in designing a response to this call for action. This potential approach will set greenhouse gas emissions reporting and reduction requirements for buildings over 2,322 square meters, or 25,000 square feet. Our climate plans include actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from homes and buildings of all sizes. This approach is starting with large buildings for a few important reasons. First, research into other places that have implemented such requirements indicates that many large commercial and retail buildings are likely to have more capacity to make these changes sooner. Second, large multifamily residential buildings will need as much time as possible to understand and plan for greenhouse gas limits. Signaling these requirements now gives these building owners and managers a longer time to prepare. This longer preparation time is particularly important for multifamily buildings, who may need more time to incorporate retrofits into their financial planning. Lastly, large buildings are fewer in number, but higher in greenhouse gas emissions. So setting greenhouse gas limits for large buildings is an efficient approach for significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. This diagram shows the main elements in the proposal to manage greenhouse gas emissions in large buildings, starting on the left. Building owners would register their buildings with Metro Vancouver and provide a few key details about the building. Registration and reporting of a building's greenhouse gas emissions are essential to understanding how many greenhouse gases each individual building in the region emits. Under greenhouse gas limits, building owners would need to reduce building emissions more and more over time, ultimately achieving very low or zero emissions on or before 2050. The limits would likely be different to reflect different building types and sizes in the region. There will be different pathways to achieve these limits, recognizing that buildings may need to take different approaches. Flexibility and special considerations for certain buildings are common in other places that have similar requirements. and will be based on a number of factors, including equity, affordability, and fairness. And finally, the potential approach would account for the principle of cost recovery to run a streamlined program and to assist building owners to cost-effectively transition to zero-emissions technology. We are starting to see and feel the effects of climate change in this region. At the same time, we are facing significant housing affordability challenges. In response to this, the approach will consider affordability, equity, and fairness. For example, setting future requirements as early as possible will give building owners and managers more time to plan for changes. This allows costs to be spread over time and for more retrofits to occur within the existing renewal cycle of a building, such as replacing a gas boiler with a low or zero emissions alternative at its normal end of life. Flexibility and options for how buildings can meet final greenhouse gas limits will also be considered, as will feedback and ideas on existing or new support programs that can help building owners to make the necessary shifts. All levels of government in BC are undertaking strong action to combat climate change. Buildings are a key area of this work. As we engage and shape our approach, Metro Vancouver will continue to work with the province of BC and local governments in the region to ensure that any future proposed requirements will be coordinated and consistent. We are also working with the building sector to shape this approach to reducing emissions. We are considering how this approach for managing greenhouse gas emissions in large buildings could overlap with recently proposed amendments to Metro Vancouver's boilers and process heaters emission regulation that may also affect other emissions from large buildings. Engagement on both of these initiatives is happening now to ensure that we can integrate the feedback we hear. Thank you very much for watching this presentation. Initial engagement will be open until November 30th of 2022. We would really like to hear your thoughts and feedback on the potential approach and for you to be a part of transitioning our buildings to zero emissions.